The advertisement was only 11 words long. Rancher seeks honest woman. Frontier life. No pretense required. Constance had read it 4 times before she folded the newspaper and slipped it beneath her pillow like something she wasn't ready to admit wanting. She was 26 years old, living in a house that smelled of candle wax and expectation, in a city where every dinner party was a negotiation and every compliment carried a price. Her mother had already chosen a husband for her, a banker named Gerald Fitch, who wore his ambition the way other men wore cologne, thick and impossible to ignore. Gerald was not cruel. He was simply the kind of man who looked at a woman and saw a reflection of himself he wished to polish and display. Constance had spent her whole life being polished. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday morning while her mother was at church. She kept it plain and honest, the way the advertisement had asked. She said she was capable and unafraid of hard work. She said she had no illusions about frontier life. She did not mention the house on Belmont Street, or the bank accounts, or the fact that her father's name opened doors in 3 states. She signed it simply, Constance Eileen Voss, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 3 weeks later, a reply came. It was written in a careful, unhurried hand, the kind of penmanship that suggested a man who thought before he wrote. His name was Nathaniel Hawthorne. He owned a cattle ranch outside a small town called Delwood in the hill country of central Texas. He said the land was dry in summer and beautiful in the early mornings. He said he was not a man of many words, but that he meant the ones he used. He did not describe himself beyond that. He did not ask what she looked like. He asked only one question, underlined once at the bottom of the page. Are you coming because you want to, or because you have nowhere else to go? Constance sat with that question for 2 days. It was the most honest thing anyone had asked her in years. She wrote back a single line. Both. But I'd like the wanting to win. She was on a train west within the month. The town of Delwood was smaller than she'd pictured. 1 main road, a handful of storefronts, a church with a bell that leaned slightly to the left, as though it had grown tired of standing straight. The afternoon she arrived, the dust was up, and the sky had that particular shade of pale blue that exists nowhere east of the Mississippi. Constance stepped off the platform with 1 trunk, a leather satchel, and the very deliberate posture of a woman who had decided not to be afraid. She recognized Nathaniel Hawthorne immediately, not because he was remarkable looking, though he was. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair pushed back beneath a worn hat, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. She recognized him because of the way he was standing, slightly apart from the small cluster of townspeople who had come to watch. Arms at his sides, not performing patience, just possessing it. He was watching her the way a man watches the horizon, steady and without any particular urgency. He took off his hat when she reached him. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne," she replied. That was the entirety of their first conversation. He picked up her trunk without asking, carried it to the wagon, and helped her up with 1 hand that was rougher than any hand she had ever held. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved, and for the first 10 minutes of the ride, neither of them said a word. It should have been uncomfortable. Strangely, it wasn't. "The judge is available Thursday," Nathaniel said finally, eyes on the road. "Thursday is fine," Constance said. He nodded once. She watched his profile for a moment, the set of his mouth, the small tension that lived just beneath his left eye, and then she turned to look at the land spreading out around them. Red soil, scrub oak, a line of hills going blue in the distance. It was nothing like Philadelphia, It was nothing like anything she had ever known. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that this did not frighten her. They were married on a Thursday morning with the judge, a woman named Mrs. Ida Briggs, who ran the dry goods store, and a teenage boy named Tuck, who served as witness and spent the entire ceremony examining his own boots. Nathaniel said his vows in the same tone he used for everything, measured, deliberate, like each word had been considered before being released. Constance said hers clearly, without trembling. When it was done, Ida Briggs patted Constance on the arm and said, "He's a good man, honey. Just needs time to remember it." Constance filed that away quietly. She would think about it later. The ranch house was modest and clean in the way that suggested a man who lived alone and had made a private agreement with order. There were no unnecessary things. The kitchen was functional. The curtains were plain. There was a shelf of books near the fireplace, more than she expected, and a framed piece of paper on the wall above the desk that she didn't examine closely on that first evening, because Nathaniel had moved slightly in front of it when she drifted that direction, not blocking her view exactly, but repositioning himself in a way that made her feel the subject was closed without a single word being spoken. She let it go. That first week, they moved around each other carefully. He was up before dawn every morning, out to the cattle before the sky had fully decided on a color. He came in for supper, ate with quiet appreciation, helped clear the table without being asked. He answered questions. He did not ask many. He was not cold. That was the thing she kept returning to. He was not cold, and he was not unkind. He was warm in the way an ember is warm, not blazing, not demanding your attention, but real and steady and present. If she was struggling with a latch on the window, he would appear beside her and fix it without making her feel foolish for not managing it herself. If she mentioned in passing that she had never learned to ride properly, he showed up the next morning with a gentle mare named Pearl and 2 hours set aside on a Saturday. He simply did not talk about himself, not his past, not his family, not why a man who could clearly read and write and think with uncommon precision had ended up running cattle in a dry corner of Texas entirely alone. Constance was patient. She had come here, after all, to build something, not to tear things open. But on the 9th night, she was setting the lamp on the desk before bed, and her eyes found the framed paper again. Nathaniel was outside. She leaned close, just for a moment, just to see. It was a certificate of some kind, official, stamped. The ink had faded at the edges, but the name at the top was printed clearly. It was not the name Hawthorne. Constance straightened slowly. She set the lamp down. She walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sound of the wind moving through the scrub outside. She had married a quiet man, and she had just discovered that quiet, it turned out, was not the same thing as simple. Constance did not ask him about it that night. She thought about it, the way you think about a stone in your boot, aware of it with every step, but choosing the moment carefully before you stop to deal with it. She lay in the dark, listening to Nathaniel come in from outside, heard the soft sounds of him moving through the house, the creak of the chair by the fireplace where she had learned he sometimes sat for an hour before sleeping. She did not know what he did in that chair. Read, maybe, or simply existed in the quiet the way some people need water. She stared at the ceiling and reminded herself that she had secrets too. Not the same kind, perhaps. But she had not told him about Gerald Fitch. She had not told him about her father's money, or the fact that 3 people in Philadelphia were likely furious with her right now. She had arrived here presenting herself as a capable, unattached woman seeking a plain life, which was true. But it was not the whole truth, and whole truths, she was learning, were rarer than people admitted. So she waited. October arrived, and softened the heat just enough to make the mornings bearable. Constance had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a determination that seemed to genuinely surprise Nathaniel, though he never said so directly. She saw it in the way he watched her sometimes, not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet recalibration, as though he kept expecting her to reach her limit, and she kept not reaching it. She learned to start the fire without help. She learned which of the cattle were temperamental and which could be approached without ceremony. She learned that Pearl the mare had strong opinions about puddles, and that Nathaniel thought this was faintly amusing, which she discovered only because she caught the corner of his mouth moving upward one afternoon when Pearl planted all 4 feet and refused to cross a particularly shallow one. "She does this every time?" Constance asked. "Every time," he said. "And you keep bringing her out. She's good in every other way." He said it simply, without irony, as though the one difficulty was simply part of the full picture, and the full picture was still worth keeping. Constance had thought about that more than once since. It was Ida Briggs who gave her the first real peace. Constance had come into town for flour and thread on a Wednesday, and Ida was in her usual position behind the counter. Reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, inventory ledger open, appearing to work while actually monitoring every living soul who walked through her door. "You're settling in," Ida said. Not a question. "I am," Constance said. "He feeding you enough?" "He forgets sometimes. Not on purpose. He just gets into his head." "He's attentive," Constance said carefully. Ida studied her for a moment over the glasses. "He tell you anything about before?" Constance kept her expression even. "Not much." Ida made a sound that was not quite a sigh. She folded her hands on the counter and appeared to weigh something privately. "I'm not one for other people's business," she said finally, which Constance suspected was both true and complicated. "But I'll tell you this much. Whatever you find out, and you will find something out eventually, everybody does, don't let it make you forget what you've already seen with your own eyes. The man in front of you is the true one." She slid the flour across the counter and went back to her ledger. Constance rode home with that sitting in her chest like a coal, warm and slightly difficult to breathe around. The letter arrived on a Friday. She knew it wasn't meant for her eyes, because Nathaniel took it from the postmaster himself, which he rarely did. He usually let Constance collect whatever came, indifferent to correspondence in the easy way of people who don't expect anything good from it. But this Friday, he had come into town on an errand of his own, and he was at the post office window when she arrived, and she saw the envelope pass into his hand and watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. Go still, completely still, the way water goes still before something moves beneath it. He folded the letter without opening it and put it in his inside coat pocket. He turned and saw her standing there. Something passed across his face, not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been seen at a moment they would have preferred privacy. "Ready to head back?" he said. "Whenever you are," she said. Neither of them mentioned the letter. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different quiet than their usual one. Their usual quiet was comfortable, 2 people who had stopped needing to fill space with noise. This quiet had an edge to it, not anger, more like the silence before a conversation that both people know is coming, and neither knows how to begin. That evening after supper, Nathaniel sat at the desk for a long time. Constance sewed near the fire. She did not look at him directly, but she was aware of every small movement, the way he turned the envelope over once in his hands, set it flat on the desk, turned it over again. He never opened it. When he finally rose and said goodnight, he left it sitting there face down, and she noticed that he placed a book on top of it before he went to bed. She did not move the book, but she saw the return address before it disappeared beneath the cover. Office of the Circuit Court, Hays County, Texas. She asked him on a Sunday. Not directly. Not about the letter. Not about the name on the certificate. She asked him something smaller, a door she could open gently rather than force. They were outside after church. They had fallen into the habit of attending, less for devotion than for the way it anchored the week, and they were walking back along the fence line the way they sometimes did, not quite side by side, not quite at a distance. "Did you grow up in Texas?" she asked. A pause. Not long, but present. "No," he said. "Where then?" He looked out at the hills. "Virginia, originally." She waited. He said nothing more, but he didn't close the subject the way he sometimes did, with that subtle shift in posture that meant the door was shut. He just let it sit there, open, like he wasn't sure himself what to do with it. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He thought about that for longer than the question seemed to require. "I miss who I was there," he said quietly. "Not what happened after." It was the most he had ever offered her. Constance did not push further. She simply walked beside him and let the words settle between them like good rain on dry ground. Not dramatic, not rushing anywhere, just soaking in slowly, the way things do when they are finally allowed to. But that night, alone with her thoughts, she turned it over carefully. Virginia, a different name, a court document, a letter he couldn't bring himself to open. Nathaniel Hawthorne was not who he had started out as, and whatever had changed him had followed him all the way to Delwood, Texas, and was now sitting under a book on his desk, patient as a creditor, waiting to be answered. She found out on a Wednesday, the way most true things arrive, quietly, without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary day. Nathaniel had ridden out to the far pasture before dawn to check on a section of fence that had been giving trouble. He expected to be gone until midday. Constance was in the house, reorganizing the kitchen shelves, when the wind pushed the desk drawer open. The old wood had warped slightly with the change in season, and the letter slid forward into plain view. She stood across the room and looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked over and picked it up. She told herself she would only look at what was visible, what had already partially unfolded at the seal. But the truth was, she needed to know. Not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to fear. The particular fear of a woman who has begun to care for someone and suddenly understands how much it would cost her to lose them. The letter was from a county court clerk. It was brief and formal. It referenced a case number and a name, Nathaniel Elias Corwin, and informed him that the matter of his brother's estate had been formally closed, all prior claims settled, and that no further legal obligation remained on his part. Corwin, not Hawthorne. Constance sat down slowly in the desk chair and read it twice. She was still sitting there when she heard the horse outside. Nathaniel came in through the back, the way he always did, pulling off his gloves as he crossed the threshold. He stopped when he saw her at the desk. His eyes went to the letter in her hands. He did not move for a moment. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and is not entirely sorry it has finally arrived. He hung his hat on the hook. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her steadily. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I just hadn't found the right way in." "Corwin," she said quietly. Yes, that's your name. It was. He paused. It still is, legally. Hawthorne was my mother's family name. I started using it when I came to Texas. It wasn't to deceive anyone. I just needed... He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. I needed to be someone who didn't carry what that name carried anymore. Constance set the letter down carefully. What did it carry? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he looked at the window, at the pale afternoon light coming through, and he began. He had been a lawyer in Virginia, not a struggling one, a good one, from a family with standing and a name that meant something in 3 counties. He had a younger brother named Caleb, who was charming and reckless in equal measure, the kind of man who borrowed against the future with a smile that made people forget to ask for collateral. Nathaniel had spent years quietly managing the damage Caleb left behind. Paid debts, smoothed reputations, stood beside him in rooms where he should not have needed standing beside. Then, Caleb had gotten involved with a land deal that was not legitimate. Other people's money, other people's trust. And when it collapsed, Caleb had disappeared west, and the name Corwin had been left sitting in the wreckage like a burnt beam. Nathaniel had not run. He had stayed and faced every creditor, every court, every conversation. He had sold his own property to cover what he could. He had done everything a man could do to honor a debt that was not technically his to honor. And when it was finally resolved, when the last signature was signed and the last door closed, he had looked at the life remaining to him in Virginia and understood that there was nothing left of it that he recognized. So he came west. He bought land with what remained. He chose his mother's name because it was the only part of his history that had never caused anyone pain. And then, after 2 years of silence and solitude, he had placed an advertisement in a frontier newspaper. 11 words, because he was, underneath everything, still a man who believed in honesty, even when he was afraid of it. I should have told you before the wedding, he said. His voice was even, but his hands on the table were not entirely still. That was wrong of me. I know it. Constance looked at him for a long moment, at the lines around his eyes that she had assumed were from sun and weather, and were perhaps also from years of carrying something heavy in a quietly dignified way. At the hands that had fixed her window latch and saddled Pearl without being asked, and placed a book over a letter because he was not ready and was honest enough with himself to know it. You paid debts that weren't yours, she said. They had his name attached to them. That made them partly mine. You lost everything doing it. I lost the things that could be lost, he said. I'm still here. She stood up from the chair. He watched her, uncertain for perhaps the first time since she had known him. She walked around the desk and stood beside him, and he turned to look up at her, and she could see plainly, for the first time, all of it. The exhaustion he had been carrying, the hope he had been carefully rationing, the fear that even now, even after everything, someone would look at the full truth of him and decide it was too much. She put her hand against the side of his face. He closed his eyes. Nathaniel Elias Corwin Hawthorne, she said quietly. I came here because I wanted to. Remember? He reached up and covered her hand with his. I remember, he said. She told him about Gerald Fitch that evening, about her father's money and the house on Belmont Street, and the life she had walked away from without a word of apology. She told him all of it, plainly, the way he had told her, not performing confession, just laying it down between them like something that had been carried long enough. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interruption. When she finished, he said, "You gave up a great deal." "I gave up a performance," she said. "That's different." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, one that lived somewhere between admiration and the particular tenderness of a person who recognizes in someone else a wound similar to their own. "I think," he said carefully, "that we may have both been looking for the same thing without knowing what to call it." "And what would you call it?" she asked. He thought about it in that unhurried way of his. Outside, the wind had come up, and the scrub was moving, and Pearl was visible through the window, standing at the fence with her characteristic air of mild personal importance. "Somewhere honest," he said finally. "Someone honest." Constance looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind she hadn't produced in years. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was also Corwin, who had been a lawyer and a brother and a man hollowed out and rebuilt by his own quiet integrity, smiled at the sound of it, the way a person smiles at something they had stopped believing they would ever have again. They were married a second time the following spring. Not legally, they were already that, but by their own private agreement, standing at the fence line at dawn, with the hills going gold around them, and Pearl observing from a respectful distance. No ceremony, no witnesses, just two people who had each survived the version of themselves that came before, and had decided, with full knowledge and no illusions, to build what came next together. By the second year, the ranch had expanded. By the third, there was a cradle in the corner of the bedroom, small, plain, sanded smooth by Nathaniel's own hands on the winter evenings when he had something to do with the hope he no longer needed to keep so carefully contained. Constance Hawthorne, who had once read an 11-word advertisement beneath a pillow in a city that never quite fit her, stood one morning in the doorway of that modest, clean house with a child on her hip, and watched her husband move across the red soil toward the barn in the early light, unhurried, steady, present, and felt something she had spent 26 years not knowing she was missing. Not rescued, not polished, not displayed. Simply known. Fully, and chosen anyway. She had married a quiet man, and it turned out the weight he carried had only made him stronger. If slow burn stories about real people finding their way to each other are what you stay for, there are more waiting for you here. Take your time. We'll be here.